Now this is the first cervical vertebrae, also known as atlas, because it is supporting the globe of the skull. That is why it is named as atlas vertebrae. And this vertebrae contains the lateral masses, the anterior arch and the posterior arch. First we discuss about the anterior arch. Anterior arch is lying on the anterior aspect and it is smaller than the posterior arch. So this is the upper border and this is the lower border of the anterior arch. This is the anterior surface which is bearing a tubercle. This is known as anterior tubercle. This anterior tubercle gives attachment to anterior longitudinal ligament, and posteriorly this anterior arch presents a facet. This facet is for the odontoid process of the axis vertebrae, that is the second cervical vertebrae. Then this is the upper margin of the anterior arch. This upper margin gives attachment to atlanto-occipital membrane, and this is the lower margin, and this gives attachment to atlanto-axial membrane. Then we come to the posterior arch of the atlas. This is the posterior arch of the atlas. Here we can see it is deeply grooved by the vertebral artery. So this is providing the passage for the third part of the vertebral artery. Also, dorsal ramus of C1 spinal nerve passes through this groove. This groove is lying just posterior to the lateral masses. So this is for the vertebral artery and the dorsal ramus of C1. This posterior arch presents a larger margin than the anterior arch. This is the upper border and this is the posterior tubercle on the posterior arch of the atlas. So this upper margin gives attachment to the ligamentum flava, and the posterior tubercle over here, this is giving attachment to ligamentum nuchae. And then on the lateral aspect on each side over here, this is giving origin to the rectus capitis posterior minor muscle. Then we come to the lateral masses. This is the lateral mass of the atlas. Over here we can see these are the two articular facets. These are deeply concaved and these are kidney shaped. These are the superior articular facets. These are articulating with the condylar process of the occipital bone. So these condyles of the occipital bone articulates with these lateral masses and forms the atlanto-occipital joint. Then on the medial aspect of these condyles, we can see these are the articular tubercle on both the sides. This is giving attachment to the transverse ligament. This transverse ligament divides this canal into two parts, the anterior and the posterior part. This anterior part is giving passage for the odontoid process of the axis vertebrae, and this forms a pivot joint. This anterior arch as well as the transverse ligament forms an osteoligamentous ring which is encircling the odontoid process over here and forms the pivot joint around which axis moves in this atlanto-axial joint. Then we have this transverse process. This transverse process bears a foramen over here. This is known as foramen transversarium. This foramen transversarium gives passage for the vertebral artery. So this is the upper surface of the transverse process. This gives origin to rectus capitis lateralis and superior oblique, and this is the tip of the transverse process. This gives origin to inferior oblique muscle, and the lower lateral surface gives origin to the splenius cervicis, levator scapulae and scalenus medius muscle. So these are the attachments on the transverse process. Then we come to the inferior aspect of this bone. These are the inferior articular facets. These inferior articular facets can be identified by their oval shape and flat surface. These articulates with the superior articular facets of the lower vertebrae, that is the axis vertebrae, and forms the atlantoaxial joint. So this is all about the atlas vertebrae. Thanks for watching.